Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Wayne Welsh,
I'm Joseph Venuso.
and we are evangelists for the Hawk Ridge Church of Christ. And right now we're starting a video series on the book of Exodus. We did, last year during the pandemic, we did some Zoom video discussions on the book of Genesis, and prior to that we did the Gospel of Mark. And we're trying a new format, we're trying some new methods. We hope that you'll join us on this medium, and that we'll all be able to learn something together as we look through the book of Exodus and see what messages it has for today.
In this first video, we're going to be doing some introductory stuff, talking about some themes, a basic outline, and kind of the setting of Exodus.
Yeah. So when we start thinking about the book of Exodus, I think it's worthwhile to ask, what is this book even, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the second book of the Bible. We read Genesis, and Genesis is fairly long, but Exodus is really the second volume in what is a single composite work, which is the whole Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses. And Exodus really picks up right where Genesis left off. In fact, the first 7 verses of Exodus are a kind of a condensed form of Genesis 46. So there's a lot of continuity that's being built there. It might even be said, we're supposed to read one work, but you can only fit so much on a scroll, so you've got 5, is what it is. Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of Genesis is the problem it sets up in the first 11 chapters, where humanity is constantly caught in this vicious cycle of sin. And then you start getting into the latter parts of the book, and it's God trying to figure out how to solve the problem of sin. Well, God really has it figured out, but he's going to solve the problem of sin through a single family that he has chosen, through Abraham and through his unlikely descendants, Isaac and Jacob. And then Jacob's 12 sons, at the end of the book of Genesis, through a series of providential circumstances, end up in the land of Egypt. And when Exodus opens, all those patriarchs are dead. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are dead. The 12 sons of Jacob are all dead. But the subsequent generations are in Egypt, and things don't go well for them. And the story of Exodus is now how God gets them out of Egypt back to the promised land of Canaan. Although, even so, they don't get to Canaan in the book of Exodus. They don't get to Canaan until they get all the way to the book of Joshua.
Yeah, so we kind of have a setting here for the actual events of the story. Moses, who's the most likely writer for the book of, really the first 5 books, is writing this probably sometime not too long after the events of Exodus, kind of sometime probably after Mount Sinai and in their wilderness wanderings.
Yeah. When we start reading this, we start looking at Exodus and thinking about how it can be. Moses is the central human character in the narrative. Ultimately, in the Bible, God is the main character overall, but Moses is the central human character. And he's traditionally attributed these 5 books. We're not going to get into, I guess, all the history of the complicated updates, editing, and all this other stuff, because a lot's been written on that, and probably not a huge thing to get into for this discussion. But we start thinking about that. Moses is introduced in Exodus. The whole book of Genesis doesn't really mention him. It's just called setup, so to speak. But then Moses becomes a central human character throughout Exodus, Leviticus, all the way through Deuteronomy. And he's charged with leading the people of Israel, which is no small task, because the people of Israel generally don't tend to be the most agreeable bunch in this story. And so, I guess trying to think about the overall flow of the story, I think of Exodus as really kind of breaks into 2 parts. There's the first section, really the first 19 chapters, which are all about getting Israel out of Egypt. Right, God saving Israel from Egypt, and coupled with that, of course, you've got, their oppression in the first chapter. Moses being raised up as a deliverer in the next few chapters. God sending Moses to Pharaoh with a message to let my people go, which of course Pharaoh doesn't take kindly to. Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" And God sends him a 10-part correspondence course in response. God sends the 10 plagues, and the last of the plagues, the death of the Egyptian firstborn, is what provokes Pharaoh to not only let the people go, but to actually drive them out. in an event that it comes to be commemorated as the Passover. And then in Exodus 13, 14, 15, they cross the Red Sea. They make their final exodus from Egypt. And then chapter 16 through 19 is all about them wandering through the wilderness until they get to their destination, not the land of Canaan, which should surprise us, but rather to Mount Sinai, which where God has a few things to say to them. And then the remainder of the book, Exodus 20 through 40, is all about what happens at Mount Sinai. Really, you might even include 19 in that bunch as well. Chapter 19 is kind of a hinge that ties the two sections together, with God bringing them together at Mount Sinai.
Yeah, I think that's important split there. As you mentioned, going from being under the oppression of Pharaoh, and you have them with the Exodus a little bit before 19, but that journey to Mount Sinai, and even Mount Sinai itself, is kind of this transition period of, well, they're going from this oppressive Pharaoh and king to what now? Well, service under God. And there's this whole procedure of their covenant with God and them honoring God and what that looks like to go from Pharaoh, this God king, to the true God.
Right. Yeah. So the whole section at Sinai, chapters 19 through 24 is all about the covenant, right? God speaks the Ten Commandments to them. God gives them other laws. And both in chapter 19 and in chapter 24, the Israelites repeat this phrase, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. We will be obedient. And so the covenant is ratified. Then we get into a much longer section about the tabernacle, which is kind of crucial to the whole story because no other subject in the law gets the attention that the tabernacle does. It's a sanctuary where God is going to dwell among his people. And so chapters 25 through 31 is blueprint instructions on how to build it. And chapters 35 through 40 are the narrative of how they built it, and it's almost verbatim repetition. They did just as the Lord commanded, and it starts explaining in detail how they built it, and it's exactly the same as the blueprint section. It's the sort of repetitive, tedious reading that kills a lot of people's Bible reading plans. And you might be wondering why. And I think a huge key to all of this is what is sandwiched in between the instructions and the construction. Because sandwiched in between is chapters 32 through 34, where the Israelites break the covenant. In chapter 32, they're wondering, why has Moses been on the mountain so long? He's been getting all these instructions about the tabernacle, and, well, you know what? Let's just make a god for ourselves. And so Aaron, Moses' brother, who's supposed to be high priest, according to all the instructions that God's giving on the mountain, Aaron builds a golden calf for them, and they worship it. And God tells Moses, these people have very quickly abandoned the covenant that I've made with them. And now, leave me alone. I'm going to destroy them and start over with you. And Moses intercedes, pleads with God in chapter 32, pleads with God in chapters 33 and 34, and God relents. And what happens subsequently is they build the tabernacle anyway. And so that's really, I think, the key to understanding that whole section is the context of that break in the relationship happens, and then they still go forward with the plans for God to dwell among the people in the sanctuary anyway. That's a huge key to that final section of the book.
Yeah. You talk about, them getting tired of waiting for Moses. Their sense of all of what's going on is very similar to what you said. You kind of get bogged down by all the instructions, and it seems like they're no different in many regards. They're waiting, they're tired of waiting, tired of all the maybe the tedium of it, but despite their failure in that, like you said, the big turnaround is when Moses intercedes, God relents, and again the chapter ends with the book ends with them building the tabernacle. And
yeah, you start thinking about this whole sweep of the story. And then by the end of it, they're not in the land of Canaan. The last event of the book is they finish the tabernacle, and the glory of God manifested in this pillar of cloud fire fills the tabernacle to the point where Moses is not able to enter, which, more on that when we get into Leviticus. But and that's where the book ends, is not in the land of Canaan with Israel dwelling in the land, but at Mount Sinai with God dwelling among the people. Because that's the real point of the Exodus. That's the real goal at the end, is not just to dwell on a piece of land, but for God to dwell with his people. And so, I mean, to that end, I think it's helpful to see kind of the trajectory of the story and how it leads from one step to the next. Now, of course, Leviticus will have more to say about what it means for God to dwell with his people. And if we succeed in our Exodus series, maybe we'll do that. But I think it's worth asking a question, introduction wise. What is the point? What is the message of this book? What would you think of the main themes that we're looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, when we're reading Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, all these books, we can look at it and say, okay, these are telling us about all these events, so we know what happened to the people of Israel, right? But so much of this is not just for us to know why and how and all that, but to see the message that both they and us are supposed to get from it. New Testament refers to the Exodus as this important event over and over again, and not just the New, but the Old Testament. The prophets kind of recall this as a major event, and there's a reason for it. It's not just that's an important thing, and we have something to celebrate each year, but because it's an important thing. I think the fundamental thing about it is God's deliverance. Again, and what that all entails. It's not just beating up Pharaoh and saving getting his people out of there. It's as well as transforming his people, right? Genesis came to us with the problem of sin and how that affected not just rulers who oppressed others, but the day-to-day life of patriarchs and all these different people, and how sin affects all of them. Well, the go truly to serving God from Pharaoh takes more than just a locational difference.
Yeah. So a thing I like to bring up whenever I look at Exodus, and I think it really gets at the heart of what this book is ultimately about, is God's grace, right? We start thinking about what grace is, this undeserved gift, this unmerited favor, and you start reading about Israel and Egypt. What do they have to offer God? Well, nothing. He made them what they are, and he's going to continue to make them what they are. He does what he does for them not because they are great people, but perhaps in spite of the fact that they're not such a great people. This is a thing that God will later talk about in Deuteronomy.
Yeah.
The Lord did not choose you because you were the largest of all the peoples. He didn't choose you because you were the hardest working of all the peoples. He didn't choose you because you were the most righteous of all the peoples. You're stubborn and stiff-necked. And Exodus bears witness to the fact that they are not righteous, because every step of the way, while they're in Egypt, they're ready to give up. When they get out of Egypt, they get to the Red Sea, they're ready to give up. When they get into the wilderness, they want to turn back. They say it would have been better to die in Egypt than to go out into the wilderness and have to deal with hunger and thirst and all the trials. We think that the house of slavery is better than what you brought us to. But God is patient with them. God feeds them. He gives them water to drink from the rock every step of the way. They get to Mount Sinai. They make a covenant. The people promise to follow it, and then they break it less than 2 months later. Mm-hmm. And you think about even how they came into that covenant and the stuff that they've seen along the way. Stuff that I've never seen the likes of. How many people wish that God would speak to them personally? That God would actually audibly speak to them in a way that was just completely irrefutable. Not something vague, not some inner, better felt than told experience, but God actually speaking to people at Mount Sinai. Would that be a faith-building experience? Well, it didn't change Israel that much, because they're succumbing to idolatry and to a cheap imitation within 40 days. The best thing they could come up with was a calf. You're going to build something that looks like God, and we're going to make a calf. We made it out of gold, so that's makes it special.
Yeah.
But yeah, the testament to God's grace is that he forgives them for that, and that he is willing to go through with the covenant. And in fact, one of the key statements about God's character comes in the middle of that sandwich section I mentioned, where he appears before Moses and he declares the name of the Lord in Exodus 34, 6 and 7. The Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and the fourth generation. And we start thinking about what that means for us. That's a kind of a little credo statement for Israel that gets quoted over and over in the Old Testament. And even in the New Testament, it finds some usage. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. Glory is of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. John 1:14. These ideas that God in his character is a God who forgives sin. God wants to save his people. God wants to show compassion and grace. And while he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, there's a good chunk of Israel is left unpunished because God is a God who forgives as well. And then we start translating that to us and thinking about the salvation event as it talks to us. It really becomes about how God forgives us too, that we are saved by grace through faith, and that we are undergoing an exodus of our own. And that doesn't, there's other things we can get into in terms of Israel's faithfulness in the wilderness and how they ultimately don't make it to the promised land in the book of Numbers. But the fact that God is willing to dwell with his people and willing to do all of this for them and to never give up in that process is, I think, key to understanding the book's message, not just for them, but for us as well.
Yeah. It's easier to, get a grasp of God's deliverance from things that are no fault of our own, of outside things that, just stop the people who are oppressing us and everything's better. But for God to deliver us from the judgment we do deserve is where Exodus takes us. It is taking them from, they didn't deserve what they got in Egypt, but when they turn away from God and make these idols, and the camp is about to be swallowed up by the wrath of God, what does deliverance look like then? It looks like grace.
Right. Yeah, and so that's, I think, the big key to all of this. And understanding that Egypt may have endured their judgment at the beginning of the story, but Israel isn't that radically different from Egypt. Because some Egyptians are faithful and actually go with the Israelites. And the Israelites are stubborn and hard of heart. Kind of like the Pharaoh who wouldn't let them leave was stubborn and hard of heart. And when Israel's being oppressed as slaves in Egypt, but then they're liberated, one common trope in human history is that people who are oppressed, and when they suddenly gain power, they wind up becoming just as cruel as their oppressors were. Why do you think there's so many laws where God talks about how you don't rule with severity? You remember that you were an alien and a stranger in the land of Egypt. You remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and that in turn affects how you treat those people. Because at the end of the day, how different are you really from the Egyptians? If we read the book of Exodus and we say, I'm going to identify with the hero of the story, the Israelites, instead of the villains of the story like Pharaoh, we're reading the book in a way that it isn't meant to be read, frankly, because part of the point is that Israel isn't that different from Egypt. Their only difference is the way that God has shown them grace. And then it becomes a question of how they respond to it, just like it becomes a question of how the Egyptians respond to it, just like it becomes a question of how we respond to it, for that matter.
Yeah. You talked about these kind of all the amazing things that we read in Exodus, the plagues, the great displays of God's power, and how that could be so many times we talk about, if there's a one point you can go back in history and view this one thing. People talk about Bible events a lot of times as I'd love to see that, that miracle, that great deed, but what the people of Israel why they struggle with it so much is just as much as seeing God's power is, this great, as they say over and over, we will do all the Lord has said that we will do. And then, but because of that, they are required to do, uphold that statement. And the more and more you see of God's goodness and how far we are from that, that's a high responsibility. That's a lot to commit to. And a lot of times what we see and what God does makes our appetite much bigger than our heart actually is ready for. Mm-hmm. And they throughout all of these times are constantly failing, but there's this part of us that we want God. We want to see His greatness. We want to be part of that, but we're also, our heart's not always ready for that. As mm-hmm. Paul often talks about, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Well, I mean, I don't know how we are for time and things like that, but I think that we've generally given the big picture, mm-hmm. the big sweep overview in terms of what the book is about. Next time, hopefully, we'll talk about Exodus chapter 1 and some of the things that go into that, what happens to Israel and how they respond to it, and how God is responding to it.
Yeah.
I want to thank you all for tuning in and listening and watching this far, and we hope that you'll join us throughout this series and that we will all be encouraged and built up by it as we look at what God has done for His people.